it's a good time to start the seminar today. So first, just want to mention that there's a post-seminar reception in the Robo Lounge afterwards that everyone's invited to, so don't forget to go there if you want to. But today it's my pleasure to welcome back one of our own RI alums. Tom Howard was a PhD here at Robotics Institute, graduating in 2009. Part of the Tartan Racing team, the successful DARPA Open Challenge team. Then he moved on to JPL in Pasadena, then to MIT as a postdoc research scientist, and then now just recently started as a professor at University of Rochester. So I'd like you all to welcome Tom Howard.
Thanks. Pleasure to be back. All right, so today we're going to talk about learning models for robot decision making. So we're going to talk about a few different topics within this. This primarily builds upon, I guess, my last decade in working in various aspects of field robotics. So lots of familiar robots to people working in here. My first robotics experiences here at the university were effectively apprenticing on some of the great Sandstorm and Highlander robots, learning the ropes about what it means to build a robust autonomous system, all the way up through work I was doing at NASA, including a brief bit working on Curiosity as part of the flight software team. So one thing that is common across a lot of my observations is that we still use robots with these, we still don't have fluid ways of interacting with these very complex, very high-performance systems. So while I was at MIT, I noticed this kind of interesting pair of pictures. So, as part of the virtual challenge there, and as watching the team progress, you have this very high-performance Atlas robot performing these very interesting manipulation tasks. And to control such systems, you have several people with PhDs, helping to author these systems, helping to guide them along, helping to express the kind of constraints that we're using. So, there's a lot of domain expertise in here. Try to get these systems to achieve a high level of performance to do these kinds of tasks. So, if we want robots to actually work with people in a more natural mechanism, we need to be able to find more natural ways of communicating intent to these physical platforms. What I want to be able to do is tell a robot out in the field as if I'm out there trying to build a map or trying to do basically go out with a team of geologists and understand what an environment looks like. I want to say, drive to the left of the rocks in front of you, take a right after you crest the hill, and take a sample from the granite rock. There's a lot of context there in terms of what I want the robot to do, how I want the robot to plan its actions, and a little bit of information there about what the environment itself looks like. If you think about information there that there's a hill, the presence of granite rocks. There's a lot of kind of interesting spatial information in there that we want to be able to exploit in terms of not only understanding what we want the robot to do, but how it should expect to, take information from the world. And another example over here, motivated from the work I did on the DARPA ARM team, back at JPL, if I want to say touch the door handle with your fingertips to the right hand while keeping your wrist in view, this also expresses a lot of constraints to my system in a way that I don't necessarily want to encode directly in this. I don't want to build an executive system that one macro involves doing this particular behavior. I want to express all of these kind of interesting relationships in a very natural way. So in order to do this, if I think back to my roots in doing robot motion planning that started way back when I was working on this here, I think about the world in terms of constrained optimization. So you have some sort of predictive motion model here that describes the way the physics of your world evolves, not only your robot itself, but the things in the world that are moving. You have some set of initial conditions, you have some set of constraints that you want the robot to satisfy, and you have some objective function in the world that describes preferences over that space of possible states that you want the robot to possibly occupy. So this is hard, of course, because your inputs and your state are continuous variables, which makes it very hard to solve this problem generally in real time. So what we're going to talk about today are approaches to building models to make this search problem fairly efficient. And this involves the combination of two different, at least on the surface, disparate topics in terms of human-robot interaction and robot motion planning, but getting to the point where we're actually looking at trying to combine these fields to not only try to dictate in a natural way what we want robots to do so we can work more fluidly with them out in the field, but also guide how they're actually solving these problems or on their own from experience that they learn, not only from themselves, but actually using human intuition as well. So let's talk about some contemporary work in human-robot interaction, particularly generalized grounding graphs. So if you think about the natural language symbol grounding problem, what we're thinking about in terms of understanding robot instructions is we have some linguistic input, language here, random variable for this, and we have some environmental model, we have some context that we want the robot to make a decision upon, and we are searching for the most likely robot motion in the context of all the rest of this information. So the space of motion is vastly large, right? So making this search efficient ends up being fairly difficult to solve just in this natural form. So the first approach at doing this with graphical models might be to compose a fairly simple factor graph. So in this factor graph, you have random variables to represent your language. You also have your context for your environment model as well. You have some random variable to represent some path or some activity you want the robot to solve. And you have some correspondence variable here which dictates whether or not something is true or false. So the problem of using a factor graph for this in the context of natural language understanding might be to say, use an expression like move near the red box and blue crate. This is a given expression for you. You know you want this to be true. You know you want to maximize the truthfulness of this expression with respect to some symbolic representation or some metric representation of your motion that you want to express. So here you would take some path and try to find the most likely path which maximizes this joint product to represent the probability. So to do this, because it's not easy to encode this probability, very cleanly, we use log linear models to approximate this that we can train from examples. For those of you who are familiar with log linear models, you know that these are simply weighted functions that are trained from a corpora of examples. The optimization or the training of these weights amount to simply maximizing the log likelihood of all of your data to align all the examples you've seen with the types of predictions that you are getting out of your model itself. And what you can do is just replace the probability here with your log linear model, and then you search a large number of actions for the action which looks most likely to the one that you have trained or trained your model on. So you give it examples and you try to learn something about these. You can use things like features based on where the robot ends up, or what objects it is near, or some other kind of interesting spatial relationship or evolution of spatial relationship over time. And you can find the path which most likely represents this out of this space. So in this case, it ends up being this path. So a couple hard things about this is that it's very hard to actually train these based on just using the raw sentences because there's no context. You're not exploiting that information that we get from linguistics to say how language is or basically composes. So work that was actually done by Stephanie Telix, who was part of the group I was at MIT before she's moved on to Brown, made this great observation that you can actually do a better job of building these factor graphs if you can use the structure of the parse tree itself to actually build a better graphical model that you can independently learn individual random variables, and you do your joint inference based on making this assumption that the symbol or the symbolic representation of each phrase itself is conditionally independent. So instead of maximizing a single log linear model expression, you're actually maximizing the product of all of these individual log linear model expressions. And we, like I said, right here, we use our log linear models to do such a thing. So what this looks like is you have your space of motions, you have an environment model which has a number of colored objects in here. You do your search, you're using beam search to approximate the, basically you're taking the n most likely solutions from this space. You identify the blue crate represents basically the symbolic representation of that object in the world. The green box is another object and represents the composition of these two, because the word and in the context of these two symbols means that you are joining that, or basically your model learns to join these individual expressed symbols. You take this and you actually you look at these set of possible motions in the context of this grounding, and you can generate, you basically search for something that looks most like the motion which makes sense in with the verb move and the context that expressed by the rest of your system. So, this was applied, I guess, in a number of different programs quite well. This was done for autonomous forklift driving, where a number of actions were laid out in an environment to be able to do autonomous pallet loading. And this was also used in other contexts for doing or directing smart wheelchairs to actually build metric semantic maps of CSAIL here. So right around the time when I was leaving JPL, I got interested in this problem based on trying to figure out good ways to bootstrap the motion planning algorithms that I was developing. And I was interested in this technique, but I made two interesting observations here, which is for this class of problems, we're trying to infer not necessarily the action that we want the robot to solve. What I'm interested in is how do you actually get your robot to understand the problem it's solving before actually initiating any kind of planner, is that when you have these sets of things, you have this exponential growth in the number of evaluations for these sets, right? When you're looking for the truest something, and that something happens to be something which is a power set, you can have this exponential complexity in the algorithm which makes it intractable to run in real time. So, so this makes it very hard to actually use this approach in its kind of natural configuration as it was. And this notion of inferring directly in the space of robot actions, or the actual state of the robot or trajectory of the robot, makes it very difficult to generalize. So if you think about the motion of an individual robot and you look at other ones as well, say pick up the hammer, the wheel garage PR2 and a U-bot, if you think about what's actually going on in terms of the state time trajectories of the individual degrees of freedom, they look very, very different. But if you think about the way that the constraints or the spatial relationships between these objects actually change, they're actually quite similar, right? You're thinking about achieving force closure around a hammer in the scene, you're thinking about displacing that object vertically, and you're thinking about eliminating the contact constraint between its original supporting surface between the hammer and the table. So the question now becomes, how do we use such techniques in probabilistic inference to actually infer the types of constraints that we want to bootstrap motion planners in a way that actually runs in real time so we can interact with robots in the manner that I wish. So if we revisit our original constraint formulation, the problem really becomes, how do we infer this part of our constrained optimization formulation? So we assume we know a predictive motion model, we assume we know what the world looks like, and we assume that we know what our cost function is, but we don't know what the kind of constraints we want to express to actually guide our motion planning problem itself. So when I talk about constraints, they're really just any pairwise spatial relationship between pairs of rigid bodies in the world at any given time, or they can also be the same rigid body evolving in varying time, right? So if I think about motion of an object or velocity of an object, those are all kinds of constraints that we may want to express in our system. So you'll see I'll list C1, C2, C3, etc. Really, I'm just talking about potential sampled constraints that you can use to compose in a set of constraints to actually formulate a reasonable motion planning problem. So very simply, approach the blue box actually looks just like the expression of a minimum distance constraint with this object while also expressing collision avoidance constraints. Here we do not explicitly state that we don't want to physically interact with any object in the world, because if you want to express an instruction like slide an object across the table or push something, now all of a sudden you're violating the initial assumptions that you may have encoded into your system. So if you want a truly flexible system that can physically interact with the world, you cannot make these broad-based assumptions that you can't touch certain objects or violate certain constraints that you may impose in your system to make it tractable. So we revisit our formulation here based on our initial model. We see we have very, very large number of these sets of constraints, which makes this actually quite hard to infer in real time, because you have to search the power set of these. Certainly, as soon as you get a few dozen of these constraints, very quickly you're solving in the billions of evaluations of this log linear model, which will limit your ability to make this run in real time, certainly on embedded hardware. So here is where we get to distributed correspondence graphs. So when I got to MIT, I was working on this problem and made this interesting observation that the problem of actually solving or inferring constraints for motion planning problem is a little bit different than the one actually solving in the space of the most likely actions, because the space is actually bounded. The number of constraints I could possibly express to my system based on the objects I perceive is a finite number. So I can actually explicitly represent all of my possible constraints that I could express in my system as individual factors inside my model. And in this case, it's not necessarily what I know to be true, which is that I have an unknown motion with a known correspondence variable. Here I know the possible constraints I can express to my system, but I don't know whether I want to express them. So if I want to compose my set, I'm looking to see whether or not I want to include or exclude this constraint from my model. And when you actually think about whether or not you should include or exclude, you make another interesting observation, which is the expression and exclusion of an individual constraint. Say you consider both to be individual cases. Say you consider contact with this object and avoiding contact with that object as two individual constraints. That ends up introducing a situation that causes your robot not to be able to find a solution. The intersection of those is the null set. So rather than just consider a binary correspondence variable, we can both make the search more efficient and actually avoid this situation where by definition you have these disjoint sets by actually introducing a ternary correspondence variable and having the number of possible constraints you have to express in your system, which saves a fair number of these log linear model evaluations when you're actually expressing these. So what this looks like in the first version of the graph that we actually produced, which was based on the predecessor of this ICRA paper that appeared in ICML workshop, is actually to just look at verb phrases themselves as something we're trying to infer constraints for, and actually using the original GQ formulation for understanding our individual objects themselves. But it's as we actually saw here, where you actually have a pair of objects for this and this idea of actually expressing sets of constraints applies just as well to sets of objects. So if we have individual objects, again, as some sort of, or as something which is bounded, it's defined by our environment model, we can now look at whether we want to include or exclude these objects in our sets and build a different type of graph, which on the surface actually looks much more complicated than the prior graph. But if you think about the number of evaluations you're going to have to use to express this model, instead of having a linear number of factors based on how many phrases you have, with a potentially exponential number of symbols based on the number of objects that may appear in your sets, you now have a linear number of phrases with a linear number of symbols vertically with a constant number of correspondence variables, which has a dramatic impact on the runtime or the effective runtime of your algorithm when actually trying to make this, or when trying to run this in real time for inferring planning constraints. So one thing you can do is just kind of more or less a side comment is this observation that if you want to do things like exclude symbols from particular phrases, that can be done, although we've moved away from this principle to just include all of our potential symbols and find faster ways of reducing our graph based on inferring rules for how to construct these graphs, but more on that in a few minutes. So mathematically what this looks like is a model which goes from a single product over unknown groundings to a double product over unknown correspondence variables for each phrase and each possible factor or constraint or object that may appear in the expression of your symbol. Now, what's nice about this is now you can you can search a novel expression for a set of constraints, like move near the red box to the blue crate. You see that we're inferring the implicit spatial relationships between our other objects in the world that we learn from data that we get from Mechanical Turk and human subject experiments. But we are also inferring a goal region, which is the effective overlapping state space that is provided by the two original goal regions, which may be expressed by this object and this object. So we didn't have to worry about actually laying out a state action space and coming up with a set of motions which may possibly represent whatever expression I may give the robot. I'm simply inferring a representation of the problem, which I then hand off to whatever planner I may have. So once you have this, you can hand it over to whatever simulator or whatever dynamics-based motion planner you have, generate your motion, and go from there. So next obvious question is, how do we train these models? So one of the things that we do is we actually look at motions and solutions from motion planners as the way that we can make the constraints legible to non-experts. So if we ask everyone to label a planning constraint or a set of planning constraints in the context of some text description of the environment, most people are going to have a hard time actually describing or understanding what happens. But if you use motion planners as a way of expressing visually what's going on in the scene, you can actually find reasonable solutions that are evident to people who are non-experts to provide natural language descriptions of robot behavior. So in this case, somebody would have given move towards the green object. What's interesting about this is actually there are lots of kind of coincidences that may appear based on your environment. So here, another perfectly logical expression for this set of constraints may also be to drive past the blue object towards the green object. So one of the things we do to avoid these cases is we actually sample a number of different motions in randomized environments, and we come up with we ask for a coherent description that applies to all of them to tease out the environmental sensitivities which may be completely unimportant to the high-level description of the planning problem that we want to express. So back in 2014, we wrote a NICR paper on this. We looked at a comparative performance for this problem of using the original formulation based on the constant number of unknown groundings, and actually demonstrated this exponential versus linear complexity that we got. To illustrate this, this is actually back from when I gave a talk at Rochester, way back when I was at MIT. If you consider the number of evaluations you have to consider when you're considering the truest set of objects, when you have these 30 objects, you're looking at evaluating your model 1 billion times. But if you can assume conditional independence across each one of these objects and consider them purely to be included or excluded in your set, which you can do because your world model is the context in which you are inferring inclusion or exclusion on in addition to the language, now you're looking at a much simpler or much faster evaluation of your model, which enables it to run effectively in real time. Another nice thing about constraints, as opposed to motions themselves, is that if your world is dynamic or your world is effectively evolving over time, the spatial relationships that we're trying to solve for aren't changing. So all three of these motions are from the same initial set of conditions, with the exception of certain objects are launched into other objects and bounce around inside of our simulator. So if you look at the motions themselves, here your object actually flies towards you, so your motion is very short. Here it's going away, and here it's going even farther away. All of these actually represent the exact same thing. So even if you trained your model a situation which is not dynamic, you apply it to a world which has dynamics, and those constraints aren't changing. So if you're say tracking objects or you're following objects in the world and the environment is moving, that doesn't mean you need to train a brand new model for an environment that moves. The other interesting thing is if you start looking at the world in terms of just generalized kinematic chains of rigid bodies, you can now start to play games with switching around your objects and trying to learn models that are truly generalizable across your kinematic chains. So if you think about moving towards an object and trying to identify features that look at the root of your kinematic chains, or if you think about making contact with objects, think about touching objects, and you look for the end of your kinematic chains and try to infer effectively what does it mean to be a finger on an object, and where does that actually work out to be in your physical description of your robot. Now you can look at actually transferability across these individual models, and we have some interesting early results on being able to take a model entirely trained for this robot, put in another robot, and get at least first order reasonably legible solutions for that. So while I was there, we open sourced this. It's called Human to Structured Language. This is actually outdated now that it moved to GitHub. But the base code for applying this and actually imposing or producing our search is actually open sourced. So in the grand strategy of make something interesting, put it on every robot you can find, and find the new holes and interesting research problems to find, we've been applying it on a number of different tasks and different projects. One of the other interesting ones is on this RCTA program. So we took a very complex expression, so swiftly walk near the 3 red trucks in the left of the blue field and stay to the right of the sidewalk. So here, a fairly large parse tree, and if we apply our distributed correspondence graph in a space of symbols which are used to drive an intelligence architecture, very quickly you're able to generate a reasonable solution for a symbolic representation of the planning problem you want to hand off to your intelligence architecture. Now, this was much faster based on assuming this conditional dependence, but we're still looking at, in this case, about 5 seconds to actually generate this with our first order model. So we've actually looked since at ways of improving the speed of this by trying to learn simplified representations of this that we'll talk about in a few minutes. But what happens with this is we generate like I said, a symbolic representation of the planning problem we want to solve, and then we hand it over to a robot, and there's a large autonomy architecture which is responsible for actually satisfying that set of constraints. When I was at MIT, one of my colleagues from my time here, Ross Nepper, who's now a professor at Cornell, he was also working on cooperative robot furniture assembly. So here you have a pair of U-bot robots, and you have a set of tables or table legs and a table, and the goal is to go from here to here. So the language that Ross developed, or these tools that was called ABPL, which is a robot programming language that had a set of preconditioned relationships and expressions that caused this nice coordinated synchronous behavior between a pair of robots to do this assembly. In a manner, I guess a fun experiment we ran just in a few days, we tried looking at giving natural language descriptions to these ABPL preconditioned relationships, and was able to fairly quickly train up a model based on our base distributed correspondence graph code that were able to give it these nice expressions and actually get this team of robot behaviors to go ahead and do some of this assembly. I also worked with a pair of students who were actually part of a high school outreach program that both have gone on to be undergrads at MIT for doing natural language symbol grounding in the context of quadcopter navigation and trying to make this more computationally efficient by learning rules for building simplified graphs. But we can replace our kind of natural control for this by just inferring the natural language or inferring the planning constraints for this planner, which is just serving between these two positions by inferring which object to hover over. So one of the other things we were looking at is, there's a lot of other context in which that we can exploit from these natural language descriptions beyond just trying to understand what we want the robot to do. So if I have a pair of images from the operator's perspective and the robot's perspective, so go to the hydrant behind the cone. From the operator perspective, you can see a hydrant, so that's perfectly fine. We're using these fiducial labels to do tracking these objects. But from the robot's perspective, we can't actually see the hydrant. So it doesn't exist in our world model, which makes it very hard for the robot to understand what does it mean to navigate to this object that doesn't even exist in my world. But we are expressing this notion of going to a hydrant behind the cone, and the hydrant behind the cone is information which is supporting our perception system, which may be fusing it from cameras and lasers and whatnot. So what we do is we introduce our map as a latent variable, and we introduce these observations we get from language, and we try to glean out any of these other spatial relationships which may exist, which means that we're effectively double dipping in our language in the sense that we get our utterance, we put it through our H2SL framework, we infer a set of annotations or bits of descriptive information that we can fuse with the rest of our sensor data to build a map, and then we re-infer our utterance for behaviors based on our distribution of maps to infer a set of behaviors that we want the robot to execute. So if we go to the hydrant behind the barrel and we can only see the barrel initially, we're able to infer a distribution of potential locations of these cones we want the robot to behave, and now it's no longer searching in a purely exploratory, uncertain manner, and we're able to help guide our robot to actually move in a direction which is certainly much, much better than just trying to do blind search with objects that we can't necessarily see. So here we can exploit not only information about what we want the robot to do from the operator, but actually information from the environment and their own point of view and sensing capabilities. So it's a fairly simple example. We've also put this on smart wheelchairs as well. So this appeared at ICER in 2016. Here we ask to go to a cone behind a garbage can. So we have two garbage cans and we have two potential locations for these spatial relationships. It can't directly observe the cone. At this point, we're capping our perception system within this radius here. So it actually chooses to go in the wrong way first. So it will actually explore in this region over here. It'll notice the absence of any cones or any objects. That negative information is fused in with the rest of the information that we get from language and guides our robot over to the right spot. And eventually it finds it. Okay. So, all right. So this is great, but the one challenge with this is that the space of potential spatial relationships becomes quite large, particularly when you think about individual regions between pairwise objects. So if you think about staying to the left of the front of the room at the back of the building, there's a lot of potential symbols that you could express if you think about all spatial relationships within regions that are with respect to each other. So another example of this is a simple picture of a kitchen. If I ask you to pick up the mug and the plate to the left of the sink, there's a whole bunch of objects in here, a whole bunch of stuff which is irrelevant, and if I think about all those spatial relationships very quickly, I have 500,000 constraints that I need to consider, which is certainly better than searching 2 to the 503,010 constraints, but that's still a fairly large number that I want to whittle down if I want to make this run quite well in real time. So, so an interesting idea came about in terms of trying to learn a model for making our robot do a better job of understanding language, is to do a first pass on this language at a high level to infer what is the most effective graph to actually do our natural language symbol grounding upon by first looking at the kind of things we express in our world. So because I say, pick up the mug and plate to the left of the sink, and I don't say anything about, say, this pitcher, we can start to whittle out things that we may actually decide are irrelevant, and we have a lot of data about what is salient and what is completely irrelevant from this based on the natural language corpora that we collect by running the kind of experiments I talked about before. So our first pass of language is trying to infer a set of rules that tell us something about how to actually build these graphs, which look at the expression of individual spatial relationships with the expression of individual objects. So because I mention a plate, a mug, a plate, and a sink, and I mention up and left inside of this, we know by looking at the data the presence of those symbols in the grounded expression that we're training off of tells us something about the kind of symbols we likely are going to express in our graph in large regions that are just completely irrelevant by doing this high-level pass in our language. So just as before, when we introduced our maps as our latent variables, we're now introducing a new set of latent variables based on the kind of graphical models that we're using to understand our language. We integrate this out and use a set of these simplified graphical models to infer what the meaning of the expression is. And we put this on our original corpus. And something that was originally running about half a second now runs in more than order of magnitude faster, which has also impacted the speed of that original example I mentioned with the go swiftly near the 3 red trucks on the left of the blue field and whatnot. So we did this not only part of an individual test based on the corpus that is included, or the example corpus that's included in H2SL. We looked at other examples where we're looking at introducing tens of thousands of groundings and what the effective runtime difference is, and making sure that we're not actually losing anything about our accuracy by making comparison between the accuracy of our individual models with a varying holdout for our expression. And again, we included our original G-cube comparison just as a baseline to make sure that we knew that we still are achieving our better than exponential runtime. All right, so as we go forward, now we have a faster way of generating these spatial relationships and spatial relationships between regions. So how do we use this to do a better job of navigating through these complex environments? So if we want to do something like go to the kitchen that's down the hallway, we now have these spatial relationships which describe a region within some semantic label for our room. So we can do this same behavior and annotation inference where this is now a much larger space, but we're able to infer this much more quickly. And we can look at how our understanding of the world evolves. Here, these are representative samples of what we think the world looks like based on trying to infer this information about, we know that there is a kitchen that is down the hallway, so that represents some sort of information in between those two regions, which we may be, some part of it we may be observing with our sensors and some part we may not. So this is an example of the smart wheelchair, and our initial understanding of where the kitchen is. It's just kind of we know it's down some region, but we're not very certain of where the object or where this is. We then start to make observations of what it means to be near some of these other regions. So we know a better job of where the kitchen is once we made a direct observation of the hallway. And once we know where the kitchen is, once we have a very peak distribution of this, now we can follow the rest of our actions to actually go about inferring where we should actually make our turn. More recently, in work that we're doing at the University of Rochester, in combination with MIT and Cornell on an NSF-funded program, we're looking at how to understand even more complex expressions which look at nominally identical objects, and trying to do natural language symbol grounding in the context of objects that we don't have these unique perceptual cues from them. So if I have a table with a large number of objects and I want to, say, pick the second object from the right in the row of 5 blocks in front, I want to be able to not only recognize what it means to be 5 objects in front and something about their structure and something about their shape, but we need to be able to do this very quickly. So what we do is we actually start to look at properties of the kind of containers that we are looking at, and we divide our search into a set of kind of primitive or concrete symbols that are used to help guide our search, and then we have an abstract layer which is varying depending on the kind of symbols we express down here to make our search more efficient. So now we can We can train models, again, with Amazon Mechanical Turk, not only based on individual actions and robot motions, but we can just provide, we can provide, circles or regions and ask people to produce natural language descriptions of these to provide our aligned corpus for training our models. And we can go ahead and put this on some of our robots to do our natural language symbol grounding. So this is an example of giving it a novel expression for pick up the middle block in the row 5 blocks on the right. So it has to, so it doesn't have any information about the color of the objects in the scene. You're just using the information about the objects in the context of all the other objects it has in our world to go ahead and pick up these objects and understand what it means to be the middle in 5 blocks without actually specifically encoding what it means to be 5 blocks from somebody who has expert information about this. It's just we're learning what it means to be a middle block, we're learning what it means to be a row of blocks, and we're learning what it means to be 5 blocks. All right, so now that we have a good way of representing a good way of inferring a large set of constraints that we can use to infer what we want the robot to do. Second half of this is how do we actually get the robot to go about and actually find a solution. So if we revisit our original constraint optimization formulation, we're now looking at the rest of this where we know this or we have this. How do we actually come up with a solution for this, which actually goes back way back when in some of the original work I was doing here, which is looking at parametric approximations to our trajectory planning problem where we know we have some given predictive model of how our robot moves through the world and we're trying to satisfy our initial and final constraints. The initial are given to us, the final constraints are our goal conditions. We find a solution by parameterizing our space of inputs and generating a set of correction parameters based on the shooting method, which looks at the gradient of our motion with respect to our parameter changes so that we are able to numerically generate a correction with respect to any arbitrary predictive motion model. The advantage for this, of course, is that it doesn't matter what your underlying physical simulation is doing. We can incorporate arbitrarily complex models of our wheel-terrain interaction, our shape, our dynamics of our system, or whatever we want. And we're able to compensate this entirely numerically to find the points which are satisfying our zero error constraint curves. So in a very small number of parameters, because this is effectively using Newton's method root finding, we're able to find a way to connect these graphs very quickly and in real time. We can use this to generate nice, well-separated ego graph local motion planning graphs. And we're able to repair these graphs in the context of physical disturbances, like if we have a terrain shape, if you were to look at the forward expression of all these individual motions without incorporating the terrain shape, this would be a large disconnected mess of motions. But given that we have a very fast way of solving this problem with a parametric approximation of all those inputs, we're able to do this fairly quickly. So when I was a grad student here, I was interested in this problem of how to get robots to drive when they have impaired mobility. So this is an example of a robot that I was working with in the Mars yard where the robot starts here and drives to this spot under normal mobility. And I was interested in this problem that mirrors if you have a broken wheel on the robot which causes your vehicle to move in an imperfect manner. So I convinced them to let me turn off the rear right wheel, execute the same motion, you end up dragging your wheel. And you get an imperfect motion. Now, a natural way to do this might be to actually run, Visodom at a fairly high rate and apply feedback control for this. But if you have an understanding of your underlying forward motion, you can actually incorporate this as a disturbance in your forward predictive model, compensate for this disturbance in open loop, and now not have to rely as heavily on this. So for those of you who are familiar with the work I was doing back here, once we had a very fast way of generating or solving the 2-point boundary value problem, we were interested in this problem of how to generate local motion planning search spaces. So at the contemporary work that was going on at the time was sampling in the space of inputs, which made sure that your motions were naturally feasible, but not necessarily well separated. So if you have a common set of inputs with respect to whatever the dynamics of the vehicle were, you end up having a very non-uniform expression of your motions. So if you're able to, instead of sampling in the input space, but sample in the state space of where you want the robot to go, and treat that as an input into your 2-point boundary value solver, you're able to have much, much finer control over where you want the robot to go. And when you have that, you can play other games about how to construct well-separated search spaces, like bias them based on global guidance in terms of where you want to drive the robot, or where you want to prevent your robot from going. So in this case, this is the case of trying to keep your robot within a lane. We know that we don't want to necessarily drive off to the side of the roads, so we're able to generate a search space which is nice and bounded in here. So some fun old videos from applying what is effectively the same underlying robot motion planner with a very different physical motion model underneath, but both trying to sample in a parametric approximation of your input space. We're able to use this fairly effectively for mobile robot navigation on some of the platforms that we're operating in, both very unstructured environments where being able to squeeze in between very narrow gaps ended up being important, and other situations where you have a more structured environment, but you need real-time trajectory planning, and you need to be able to consider situations like this, where the problem of actually doing your lane changes actually becomes as simple as sampling in the space of states in your neighboring path, which simplified your planning problem. So this is actually fun clips from way back when, doing some of the first cone dodging. So some scary video on the back of doing this. But again, we're just sampling in the possible space of motions where we want, or the possible states where we want the robot to go. And the last clip is actually an excerpt from the challenge itself, of a vehicle coming towards us and us turning well in advance of when the vehicle arrived to make sure that we weren't hitting it. In that case, the dynamics of the robot were interesting in that you needed to consider the delays that were inherent in your steering and the limited rate at which you could actually turn your wheel to make sure that you ended up with a safe motion. So this local motion planning didn't stop here. So my time at JPL, I spent porting over to continuous auto nav systems to be able to get robots to navigate through these nice obstacle fields. So the kind of standard steer and drive where you have a whole bunch of individual arcs moving through the environment, compared to the continuous steering and driving version with another version of this, although it stops there for some reason that I never actually quite figured out why it stopped in the video. But here we have this continuous navigation through the environment by having this continuous curvature, so we didn't have to stop and steer and then re-execute our motion. And through a number of studies, we were able to fuse some other work going on at the time with trying to port over stereo and Visidom onto FPGAs to enable this kind of fast navigation, in addition to being able to have a faster way of navigating through the world. Another interesting example of this was actually work I did as part of the motion planning lead on the DARPA ARM team at JPL back in 2010. So if you look at the space of motions and you look at the potential grasp points here, the underlying algorithm is the same. We have a parametric approximation of the space of motions we want the robot to consider. We're sampling in a space of potential motions that we want the robot to potentially grasp, considering whatever dynamics we want for our arm. And we're actually doing this for I think this was a 11-dimensional system using the 7 degrees of freedom of the arm and the 4 degrees of freedom of the neck to ensure that not only we're able to put our hand in a spot that we want, but we're able to ensure that that line of sight is not obstructed by putting our elbow in an unfortunate configuration, which for those of you who use that arm, sometimes that would end up falling naturally out of your solution. So this is doing end-to-end autonomous pick and place of a flashlight onto a piece of orange paper. The program had us putting lots of objects on pieces of paper. So here we pick up an object, see the planner running in real time. We're sampling many of these motions in parallel because each one is considered to be an individual case. We have these reactive behaviors to go touch the object to make sure that we know where the table is, and go on from there. Also see it at the beginning of this other example where we want to go and actually put a key in a lock. So the initial motion is generated using that motion. And then actually it's an example that was done by a PhD student at the time, Paula Baer, that's actually looking at deliberative interactive estimation, where in order to complement the uncertainty that you have directly from using your perception system, what you're able to do is actually deliberatively poke and prod at your environment and use information from the force torque sensor to reduce the covariance of your uncertainty of where you actually want to put the key, and only when you become confident enough, you actually go ahead and do the maneuver to actually put the key in the lock and This isn't the video that actually opens the door, but I guess it was part of a sequence which did that in the end. So for those of you who are familiar with the ARM program itself, there were lots of interesting tasks that were asked to be done. All of these were driven by kind of a high-level XML description of what we want the task to do. Some of them were fairly interesting, including picking up a fairly heavy drill for that arm and drilling a hole into a block of wood, all without any human intervention as part of that. And all of this interesting behavior was one of the things that actually motivated my interest in working on this natural language understanding problem, which is if we have these kind of capabilities, we want to start to demonstrate this, and we want to work collaboratively with robots to do these kinds of tasks. We need an effective mechanism to express these constraints to robots in a way that they can understand what they're supposed to be doing in the context of their own perceived environment. So last thing I will talk about on the planning side before going on to what we're doing now at Rochester is another form of adaptivity which I actually explored in my thesis, which is how to improve the quality of our recombinant state lattices to improve the effective optimality of global search. So for those of you who know much about state lattices, they are a set of trajectory libraries which are designed in such a way that you have uniform states that are through the world and a whole bunch of feasible edges that when composed and expanded in something like an A-star search generate a nice smooth motion planning search space. So this is nice if you design a motion planning search space and you design it for this environment and you run lots of tests and all of a sudden you land in a very different environment. You need a way to be able to repair your motion planning search space in the context of the environment that you perceive. So if you think about graphs and you think about you have this kind of uniform connectivity in between a discrete representation of nodes and edges in your graph and states and trajectories in your search space, it would actually be quite nice to be able to do something about locally modifying when necessary where your states actually move to without modifying the underlying topology of your graph. So you can still do heuristic search in this without having to actually modify this the nice properties of these recombinant state lattices. So one of the things I was exploring in my thesis was this idea of taking individual nodes and doing this relaxation using this fast parametric approximation of your inputs to guarantee smoothness or connectivity of these individual nodes without violating the assumptions of your motion model. But this is nice, but this is something that needs to actually be part of our search process. So if you actually just do this on nodes that you are looking at expanding in your graph, you're not actually able to, you don't have a good idea of where that might end up going. So what ended up being required was actually looking at a step forward inside of your search. So this is adaptive state lattice search within the A-star search algorithm, where you're actually looking at nodes that are being put onto your open list. You're actually doing your optimization in your forward step to see where they might land if that entire space was optimized, and using that as a better guide to see where you want the robot to go. So if you did the greedy version of this, where you just took your nodes here and you moved around this node based on where these edges would go, you would just move back off of this obstacle or this high cost region and still end up going straight into that. Here you actually see that because you're doing this forward look ahead in terms of where you're moving, you're actually bending these motions to be able to go around these low cost regions around that obstacle. So you have a better sense on what the effective cost of your search would be if you end up choosing to expand those in your search. So what this looks like is if you take a fixed state lattice and you apply it to this problem, you don't get this solution, which is a reasonable solution. You can see the kind of uniform layout of nodes and edges in your search space. And it is a solution. Again, high cost regions, these dark regions, and all these dots end up being our nodes. And then you take the same graph and you adapt it, and now you have a much, much faster solution through this, and you haven't actually modified the topology of your underlying graph. You're simply locally modifying where the discrete nodes in that graph map to in the physical world, only where necessary, by using the gradient of your cost of your local sets of edges. What's interesting to actually see is you have a lot of optimization, a lot of relaxation going on in between these narrow passageways, but in the relatively wide open void regions, you end up getting effective no change to your graph because there is no gradient there to tell you how to optimize. So we did this on more complex environments, some interesting results showing that If you assume, in the same case that we consider that one environment and you land in a very different environment, you would get a very suboptimal solution here. If you do the adaptive version of this, you get a much, much faster solution, even more dramatic as the environment continues. And if you look at this against a much denser representation, which is more expensive to search, you end up with effectively the same solution. And what was found over a large set of experiments is as the environment complexity increases, the effective benefit of doing your course adaptation only improved and only got better. So certainly lots of evidence actually showing over a large set of examples that actually doing your course adaptation was undercutting simply doing more sampling or adding more edges to your graph. So thinking about the way you actually search through these spaces is quite important. There's a few different variants of this, including this progressively adaptive variation where you're not actually doing all of your optimization or localization up front. You do this over multiple planning cycles. But so moving forward with this idea of actually trying to learn how to do this adaptation and trying to learn a model for how to search this, we're actually looking now in our lab at violating this assumption where you're uniformly applying this optimization. So actually thinking about where to apply this optimization, when to apply it, and which variant of the algorithm to use is something that we're very interested in learning through actually putting these things out in the field and asking it to solve hard problems and testing these hypotheses out in the real world. But there's also other variations, not only just looking at whether or not to optimize or not optimize, but actually whether or not to basically divide your nodes, increase your control set out degree, reduce your discretization, and really do something to try to learn what is the best way to build the right state lattice for an environment based on the experience of your robot without the intervention of people digging in and recompiling and redesigning new graphs with their own kind of human intuition. So last thing I'll mention is this idea of adaptive predictive motion models. This is work that I was working on when I was at JPL. It's the last bit of this that I'll talk about, where we're actually looking at our predictive motion model. So often we'll assume some description of our dynamics of our world and we'll come up with a model beforehand. But if we think about robots moving around in environments which may vary significantly, we may actually choose the wrong model, or we may choose a model which is imperfect for whatever environment we want. So we want robots to go both on and off-road or in cluttered environments and wide open spaces, and we don't want to build autonomy architectures which are conditioned on switch statements that are using certain algorithms in certain spaces. We can actually look at trying to learn a model based on information like our local elevation maps or semantic labels or information about the local context in which we are moving, and actually train something like a neural network to build a predictive model of which type of model gives us the best balance between computational complexity and prediction accuracy, so that we can learn, and this is actually just by driving over a simulated environment quite a bit and looking at that quantitative difference between the differences in our prediction and how fast and how much we're willing to trade off. They're actually able to very quickly figure out that we can get away with simplifying assumptions on our roads because the effective differences were quite small. So I guess, so we talked about all sorts of different types of models in the context of human-robot interaction, robot motion planning. We've talked about this in terms of the fidelity of the simulation, and it's really about the model, right? So, a lot of interesting work is going on in algorithms, and certainly all of that are things that we exploit. But the kind of representation that we're using to actually generate our solutions, for example, in the work that we're doing for the natural language understanding, we're not actually modifying the beep search. We're just modifying the graphs in which we are actually doing our language understanding, and actually take somewhat the perspective of the natural language understanding is effectively like a motion planning problem. It's really a graph search. So really from our perspective, it's really just about the model. So now I'm at the University of Rochester. We started up a new lab, and we're very interested in trying to extend these types of models to be able to work intelligently with people and kind of learn from their experience. We're part of this new data science initiative at the University of Rochester. We are currently looking at a few different research directions which I think are interesting, including trying to combine our natural language understanding and all of this graph optimization to try to learn how humans can actually be a part of this motion planning search space process. So if you want to, if you're out in the field with a robot and you want to modify the way it searches through the world, you should not have to turn off the robot, recompile it, and you should be able to actually use language and use natural mechanisms to modify its underlying behavior about how it actually chooses to solve the problems, not only which problems it should solve. We're looking at lots of different other contexts in our graphical models. I mean, primarily we're using our environment and our words, but there's a lot of other information about gestures and context and history that we can use to better understand what's actually going on in our world. And we're looking at trying to use these natural language interfaces and some of these other planning bits to try to build smarter assisted devices for people with physical impairments. Two last interesting directions, I guess, continues to look through this idea of trying to come up with algorithms which are truly generalizable across different systems. So what does it actually mean to have a graph learn what it means to, I guess, sample in a particular way and then put it on a very different robot? Very interested in trying to better understand, what is effectively, gained from all this experience of doing all of this field robotics and all these other examples, and that kind of art that goes along with designing really good search spaces. And also as part of this NSF-funded activity, we're looking at formal verification of human-robot dialogue. So how do you actually infer the kind of problems that we want the robot to solve and actually make sure that they are solvable in real time? So, so we're looking at actually doing natural language symbol grounding to formal languages like LTL in conjunction with Cornell University. And last, we're still continuing to look at this idea of how do we do this in unstructured environments and moving robots out of the lab and into the field for human-robot interaction. So, so I'll wrap up, about out of time. So, we've looked at adaptivity and optimization and machine learning for trying to improve the effective optimality of human-robot interaction, motion planning, and vehicle simulation. Given that it's drawn on good chunks of the last decade of my search, I want to thank a lot of the people who I've worked with in the past past decade, including my current lab students right now, some of the funded activity or some of the funding agencies that are funding my current work, and now I'll open up for questions. So thank you.
Is there any questions?
Yes.
So you emphasize the role of constraints. You use terms like near and maybe faster, which seem to be, the emphasis should be on the optimization criterion. Any reason why you're going for constraints?
So we are actually working on trying to learn weights for cost functions as well and incorporate into our framework. So we just generated constraints, and we didn't actually assign the words near or go or whatever. These are just the labels that people provide. So when we look into generating these other examples, we want to tease out the weights of cost function and not only do kind of constraint satisfaction, but actually full constraint optimization. The trick there is actually trying to come up with what are the good examples that really tease out what does it mean to be near something and how is that different than just going to somewhere. So the language again is not given by us; those are just labels people provide, but they map to the constraints that are given to us. Okay.
So I got a question, Tom, about the natural language framework. So could you comment a little bit about how you might encode or deal with uncertainty? So like if a sentence doesn't make sense, or it could have multiple meanings.
Oh yeah. So one of the I guess this is a point I should emphasize earlier on is that because we're actually using probabilistic inference, it's not necessarily that we just generate a solution for this. We actually generate a distribution of potential solutions. So if we have something like say we have a sentence and we get a set of constraints which are not solvable, and we have a distribution of somewhat equally likely solutions, it's perfectly viable to actually use another set of symbols which are nearly as likely as the first set of unsolvable symbols, generate a solution, and then do something like initiate human-robot dialogue to ask, if you are not confident enough, you're not certain enough, you could ask as part of the dialogue procedure whether or not this is what you want the robot to do. But certainly, I mean, there's lots of other issues dealing with the uncertainty of just trying to understand natural language expressions themselves, right? I mean, parsers are probabilistic inherently. So trying to understand, whether we want to, push a car near a tree, which is, the car which happens to be near the tree, or actually want to move a car to a location which is near the tree. That's part of the ambiguity of that. But actually incorporating that information about the environment in terms of understanding a parse is actually an interesting idea. Yes? So situations where we say go to the object which is not something. We haven't actually done any data collections for that, but that's certainly something we could try to consider. Again, we don't actually provide the language itself when we're doing our data collections. So I guess if we came up with certain situations where we would try to get that specific data, it'd be very interesting to see if the models can just naturally handle that. I guess because we consider constraints and you consider the complement of a region, say it's, I don't want to be near something. That's kind of like being in the other state which is not expressed, the inverted constraint, the inverted expression of a constraint which happens to be near an object. Yeah.
How do you imagine a robot's going to verbally answer the question, what do you see? And how do you imagine it's going to take verbal coaching?
What do you see? What do you mean?
I want to be able to have a conversation with a robot. So I want the robot to generate language.
Sure.
And I guess I'm sitting here wondering, how are you going to turn this around to generate language? Are you going to use a completely different mechanism than how you understand language?
So actually some researchers in HRI, in particular Stephanie Talix, has actually looked at inverting the models that she was using for kind of forward language understanding to generate language to then see if it's actually interpretable by the person. So people are actually looking at inverting these models.
I can't imagine it was.
What do you mean?
Aren't you going to get gibberish, ungrammatical gibberish out of the thing?
Well, no, because so if you generate language and then you try to reground the expression based on your own models of understanding, you should be able to understand whether or not something expresses a set of symbols, right? You just need to be able to express it as a question. So if it is, so the example of the paper that Stephanie and Ross Nepper actually wrote was a robot asking for help, and it could generate language based on trying to understand, I needed to know an object, and it would say something about referencing a particular object, and its forward model would identify that as the object described by the expression. So there are mechanisms and there are ways that people are looking at trying to invert them. But there, the computational efficiency of the model is actually very important. So that's actually one of the reasons we're very interested in this problem.
All right, I think we're a couple minutes over now, so I think it's probably a good time to finish. So let's thank the speaker, Tom, again. And a reminder that the PSR is a couple of dollars down.